All right, so we're back and diving into some pretty significant developments. Trump's back in the spotlight, aiming for a second term in 2024, and already stirring things up with his choices for key law enforcement roles. Yeah, definitely some interesting picks, to say the least. We're focusing on a BBC piece. Trump picks loyalist ex-aide Patel as FBI director. It really digs into who these people are, their backgrounds, and what it can mean for American law enforcement, like what's in store for the future. It's definitely sent shockwaves, I'd say, through the political landscape. Yeah, for sure. Let's kick things off with Kash Patel, Trump's pick for the FBI. What's your initial reaction to his background? Like, what does it tell us about how he might approach this role?
Well, Patel's been a defense lawyer and a federal prosecutor, served in the Trump administration, so he's definitely got the legal experience. But what really jumps out is his pretty vocal criticism of government institutions, especially the FBI. He's even gone so far as to call for dramatically limiting their authority, talking about getting rid of what he calls government tyranny within the Bureau.
Wow, that's strong stuff. What exactly does he mean by limiting their authority, though? Like, what kind of changes does he actually have in mind?
He suggested shifting the focus, moving away from federal investigations into things like terrorism, organized crime. Instead, he wants to prioritize more local law enforcement.
Yeah.
He's also talked about cutting back the FBI's surveillance powers, which he sees as way over the line.
Right.
Of course, that brings up some big questions about national security and that whole balance between privacy and safety. It's a tricky one.
For sure. And it seems like his stance on surveillance kind of goes hand in hand with that whole deep state thing he keeps bringing up.
Yeah.
Can you give our listeners a refresher on what that actually means and how it connects to his views on the FBI?
Right, the deep state. It's this term people use to describe this supposed secret network working within the government, often portrayed as actively working against, whoever's been elected.
Yeah.
Patel's book, Government Gangsters, he really dives into his theories about this, and it's pretty clear he believes this network has its hooks in the FBI too.
Interesting.
He's also been pretty critical of the media, seeing them as part of this deep state machine.
I see. So this idea of the deep state kind of fuels his push for reforming the FBI. And then there's his children's book, The Plot Against the King, with a character named, get this, Keeper Comey and his spy slugs. It's pretty clearly a jab at former FBI director James Comey, playing into this whole idea of deep-rooted opposition within the Bureau.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like he's using this children's book to make his ideas more digestible, more accessible. It's a tactic that's definitely resonated with some of his supporters. But of course, critics argue that it oversimplifies things, complex issues, and just breeds distrust in government institutions.
It definitely adds another layer to this whole conversation.
Yeah.
So taking all this into account, how do you think Patel's views might actually play out if he does get confirmed, in terms of actual policy changes at the FBI?
Well, he's talked about wanting to clean house at the top of the FBI, so a major personnel shakeup seems likely. He's also mentioned shifting priorities, moving away from counterintelligence and focusing more on what he calls, quote, real crimes, like drug trafficking and gang violence.
That's a pretty big shift from the FBI's traditional focus. It sounds like he wants to fundamentally change the Bureau's mission, how it operates at its core.
Exactly. And it's crucial to think about the potential fallout from such a dramatic shift.
Right.
Like scaling back counterintelligence efforts, that could leave us more exposed to foreign interference. And a laser focus on street crime could come at the expense of investigating white-collar crime, corruption. These are the kinds of trade-offs we really need to consider.
Yeah. Definitely some serious implications to think about.
Yeah,
no doubt about it. And it kind of reminds me of, what happened with Christopher Wray, the current FBI director. Trump appointed him back in 2017, but then things went south after the whole FBI investigation into how Trump handled classified documents.
right.
What's your take on that whole saga, and how does it tie into Patel's nomination now?
It's a prime example, I think, of how Trump really values loyalty above all else, When Wray refused to meddle in the investigation or personally pledge his loyalty to Trump, their relationship just fell apart.
Right.
So picking Patel, someone known for being, fiercely loyal to Trump and his views, it seems like a direct reaction to what happened with Wray.
So it's like he's looking for someone who's on the same page, who won't rock the boat, even when it comes to sensitive investigations.
Yeah, you could definitely see it that way. And it does make you wonder, will Patel put Trump's interests first, even ahead of the FBI's traditional role as, an independent investigative body? It's something the Senate's definitely going to dig into during those confirmation hearings.
For sure. Well, speaking of confirmations, let's switch gears to Trump's pick for the DEA. Chad Chronister, the sheriff down in Hillsborough County, Florida. Anything that stands out to you about his background and what it could mean for the agency?
Chronister's been in law enforcement for a long time, over 30 years. He's known for being tough on drugs and his focus on border security, which, lines up perfectly with what Trump's been promising during his campaign.
Yeah, I remember Trump specifically praising Chronister's dedication to, tackling the fentanyl crisis and securing the border. Sounds like those are going to be at the top of the DEA's to-do list if Chronister takes charge.
Most likely. He's been very vocal about supporting tougher drug policies, more border patrols, and he's actually implemented some of these things in his own county. So his appointment could signal a shift, a move towards a much harder line on drug control at the federal level.
So we've got Patel at the FBI, potentially shifting away from counterintelligence, moving towards a more local focus.
Yeah.
And then Chronister at the DEA, signaling a doubling down on the war on drugs and border security. Do you see a connection, like a thread running through these two nominations when it comes to Trump's overall vision for law enforcement?
Definitely. I think both appointments show that Trump wants to reshape these federal law enforcement agencies, mold them in a way that reflects his own beliefs and, his political agenda.
Interesting.
Loyalty seems to be key, as well as a tough on crime approach and, focusing on issues that really resonate with his base.
It's definitely a different path than what we've seen from past administrations.
It is, and it raises some important questions about where law enforcement is headed in this country. If both Patel and Chronister get confirmed, we could see major changes in how these agencies function, how they decide where to put their resources.
Right, but as you mentioned earlier, it's not a done deal. They still need the Senate's approval, and that's where things could get really interesting.
Yeah.
The Senate. What are your thoughts on how these nominations might play out in the confirmation process?
It's tough to say for sure, but I'd expect some pretty heated debates.
Wow.
The Democrats are probably going to raise flags about Patel's loyalty to Trump,
Yeah.
and whether he can really uphold the FBI's independence. And they'll definitely scrutinize Chronister's track record on drug enforcement. They'll be looking for any signs of him overstepping boundaries or, showing bias.
Do you think the Republicans will be like a united front supporting these nominees? Or could we see some pushback even from their side?
I think for the most part, the Republicans will stick together, especially considering how important these positions are to Trump's agenda.
Right.
But you might see a few of the more moderate Republicans raising some concerns, particularly about Patel and some of his more, shall we say, colorful statements.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see if any of them break ranks and vote against confirmation.
Definitely adds another layer to this already pretty complicated situation.
Yeah.
So let's zoom out for a second and think about the bigger picture here. If both Patel and Chronister do get confirmed, what kind of lasting impact could that have on the American justice system as a whole?
Well, if Patel actually reshapes the FBI the way he's talked about, we could see a major shift in priorities. Less emphasis on counterintelligence, white-collar crime, and a lot more focus on those street-level offenses.
Right.
Which could, potentially create some blind spots, like when it comes to national security threats or corporate wrongdoing, things like that.
And what about the DEA? With Chronister's focus on the border and that, hardline approach to drugs, could we be looking at a return to the policies of the war on drugs, which, a lot of people argue has led to mass incarceration and really disproportionately affected minority communities?
It's a valid concern for sure. Chronister's approach, it could definitely lead to a ramp up in drug enforcement, which might mean more arrests, longer sentences, and potentially making those existing inequalities in the justice system even worse. It's something that policymakers and advocates are going to have to keep a very close eye on.
It seems like these nominations and, everything that could come from them really highlight how crucial this upcoming election is.
Absolutely. The 2024 election, it's not just about who's in the White House. It's about setting the course for law enforcement in this country for years to come.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
Stay informed, stay engaged, pay attention to those confirmation hearings, do your research on these nominees, what they stand for, and really think about how their leadership could affect the issues that matter to you. The decisions made in the next few months, they're going to have a huge impact on the future of law enforcement in America. It's vital that we all participate in this conversation, make our voices heard.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has definitely given me and hopefully our listeners a lot to think about. The future of the FBI and DEA is up in the air right now, and the outcome of these nominations, it could have ripple effects that touch all of us. Thanks for tuning in to this deep dive.